we're going to try something new. Uh-oh, did I hear an uh-oh? Who doesn't have trust in their rabbi and cantor? I guess maybe they shouldn't yet. Okay. In any case, I hope you brought your hiking boots and your GPS of choice, because we're going into the desert together. We're almost at the end of the book of Bamidbar, which means in the desert. And in English, the book of Bamidbar is actually called Numbers, referring to the fact that it is counting or numbering the 12 tribes. And that translation comes from the Septuagint. And in a moment, we'll explain and talk a little bit more about both names, Numbers versus Bamidbar. And they certainly offer a valid looking glass and interpretation into the books in their entirety. So today we have a double portion, Matot Maseh, and we're going to delve into Matot, into one specific incident that happens in Matot, and it's a disagreement between Moses and two tribes in particular, Gad or Gad and Reuben. And in some ways, this interaction between the three, really it's the two and Moses, kind of symbolizes the Torah in its entirety. And my dear friend and colleague has graciously agreed to go on this experiment and this journey with me, because honestly, this moment is just so wonderful, and it is so full of drama, and it's a really, really meaningful moment for our people, between our people. I know it's shocking, sometimes Jews don't get along with each other. So we're going to begin. We're going to set the scene first for a moment, and like I said, we're at the end of the book of Numbers, or Bamidbar, and we're getting close to the promised land, so close, and as we know, I hope I don't ruin it for anybody, Moses doesn't make it into the promised land. I'm sorry, I know, I just destroyed you, I'm so sorry. But he doesn't. And the Israelites are going to have to figure out how to manage without him. But before they even get there, they are so close, and they still can't get to that agreement, to that perfect place of being cohesive. And then chapter 32 of Numbers opens like this.
Umikne Rav Haya Livne Reuven Velivne Gad Atzum Meod Vayir'u et Eretz Yazer ve'et Eretz Gilad V'hinei hamakom mekom mikneh Vayavo'u bnei Gad uvnei Reuven Vayomeru el Moshe v'el Elazar hakohen ve'el Nisiei ha'eda lemor Vayomeru im matzanu chen be'enecha Yutan et ha'azretz hazot la'avadecha la'achuza al ta'avirenu et hayarden. The Reubenites and the Gadites owned cattle in very great numbers. Noting that the land of Yazar and Gilead were a region suitable for cattle, the Gadites and the Reubenites came to Moses, Eleazar the priest, and the chieftains of the community and said, "It would be a favor to us," they continued, "if this land were given to your servants as a holding. Do not move us across the Jordan."
Nice.
Thanks.
So let's talk about what just happened. So they're at the land right beyond, they're right in the Jordan. They're about to cross into this promised land, and they are raising cattle. And they say it would be ideal for us if we could just stay here right across the border instead of joining the rest of the Israelites into the promised land. How do you think Moses responded to that? Let's break it down a little bit further before we jump into Moses. They use the word mikneh twice in the first verse, and that tells us something, because no language in our Torah is superfluous. There's always a reason. And when we see a word appearing twice in one verse, that's a marker. Mikneh is important. Mikneh in Hebrew refers to the cattle, meaning the cattle, but mikneh has the same root as purchase, to purchase, referring to the purchasables, the livestock that they have. So when Gad and Reuven asked to stay beyond the border in the foreign land, it's technically the foreign land and not to go into the promised land, it gives off the impression that they are prioritizing their purchasables and not staying as a cohesive unit. And you can imagine Moses isn't pleased with this notion at all. And our commentators who read this Torah portion immediately jump on it and use it to kind of fuse their idea that Gad and Reuven are bringing down the collective. They are individualistic, who are hungry for material goods, rather than remaining with their people. They're not keeping their word to God, which is even worse. And then verse 5, where we kind of laughed for a moment, where Cantor Sibo paused, I asked her to pause there because the structure of the verse tells us something also. They say, Gad and Reuven go to Moses, and they say, it would be a favor to us. And in the Torah, there's actually a big space, right? They're pausing. They know what they're about to say is not going to land well. It would be favor to us if this land were given to your servants as a holding. We'd really appreciate it. They kind of drop the bomb in the second half of the sentence. So our Torah also marks that moment with spaces. So whenever we read Torah, it's not just about the letters and the words and the black print that we see, but also where the white spaces are. They are very often intentional. And so at this point, Moses passionately pushes back in this 10-verse monologue, reminding them that what they're doing is absolutely terrible. And Cantor, I'm going to ask you to read some of those verses, but make sure you help us understand how angry Moses is. Do it well.
ויאמר משה לבני גד ולבני ראובן, האחיכם יבואו למלחמה ואתם תשבו פה. ולמה וניאון את לב בני ישראל מעבור אל הארץ אשר נתן לכם אדוני, כה עשו אבותיכם בשלחי אותם מקדש ברנעה לראות את הארץ. ויחר אף אדוני בישראל ונהיים במדבר 40 שנה עד תום כל הדור העושה הרע בעיני אדוני. והנה קמתם תחת אבותיכם תרבות אנשים חטאים.
Yes.
לספוד על הרון אף אדוני אל ישראל, כי תשובון מאחריו, ויסף עוד לחניכו במדבר, ושיחתם לכל העם הזה. Moses replied to the Gadites and the Reubenites, are your brothers to go to war while you stay here? Why will you turn the minds of the Israelites from crossing into the land that God has given them? That is what your fathers did when I sent them from Kadesh Barnea to survey the land. The Lord was incensed at Israel, and for 40 years he made them wander in the wilderness until the whole generation that had provoked the Lord's displeasure was gone. And now you, a breed of sinful men, have replaced your fathers to add still further to the Lord's wrath, against Israel, if you turn away from him and he abandons them. Once more in the wilderness, you will bring calamity upon all this people.
That was very well done. Indeed. Okay, so Moses initially responds from a place of shock. You would let your brothers and sisters go to war while you stay here in this mikne, in this area of purchasable. He interprets it as purchasables. And what's worse, you turn your back on God. And then he recalls the past. He says, we've been here before. We've defied God before, and we have this covenant, and now you're turning your back on the covenant. How can you do this? It's a very difficult moment for everybody that's involved. On the one hand, these tribes, they stay put, and they want to stay put, and they actually courageously tell Moses their desires. And on the other hand, Moses is trying to keep everyone together, and he sees these two tribes breaking away, and it scares him. And now remember, the generation of Gad and Reuven, these are second-generation Israelites. This is not Moses' generation. This is not the generation that held the trauma from Egypt. This is the generation that is going into the promised land. And Moses, in this moment, is feeling like he's losing control. He can't possibly explain to them the trauma of the past, the slavery, the escape. He's been listening to the complaints of the Israelites for decades and walking them through the desert, and he feels like in the home stretch, he cannot keep the people cohesive. So he becomes very defensive, and in that one verse, in verse 14, he says, Tarbut anashim chataim. It's essentially an insult. He says to them, the translation here was a breed, but it can also be translated as a culturally sinning individuals. You are a collective of people who sin. This is a very strong remark to make to people, let alone the people in your own tribe. And he says, you're like your forefathers, right? A group of sinners against God, those who built the golden calf, right? He still has that brewing in his memory. Here we go again. And it's difficult for him. And finding the new with the kind of old generation and trying to find that middle ground in this really pinnacle moment in our story. We're almost at the end of the book. So I want to revisit the names of the book again, Bamidbar in the desert versus Numbers, meaning the counting of our tribes. And here we are. They really depict kind of a different lens of telling the story. When we call the book Bamidbar, there's a certain desert, a certain lost. And by calling it Numbers, we're trying to find order. So even in the way that we name the books, one tries to lend itself to cohesion, to order, while the other one recognizes the chaos. And both names depict a really different lens by which our narrative is told. So Reuven and Gad, they turn to Moses and they try to explain their perspective. They explain that they want to stay part of the group, part of the collective, but they want to do it differently. Just because it's not exactly as Moses had planned doesn't mean they're leaving. They're pushing Moses to think about the grand plan just a little bit differently. And to jump to the end of the story, again, our commentators will use this to explain why Reuven and Gad later broke away from the 12 tribes. But there is an alternative reading here, one that's actually really relatable to all of us, aside from the fighting, of course. Moses eventually concedes to their request. And I'm going to have Cantor Sibo read verse 40.
ויתן משה את הגלעד למכיר בן מנשה וישב בה. So Moses gave Gilead to Machir, son of Manasseh, and he settled there.
He recognizes that this is the best he's going to get. We see another moment of growth here for Moses. He lets go of what Rabbi Mish Hammer-Kosi calls a binary reading of the text, letting go of this notion that something has to be either good or bad, positive or negative. And instead, if Moses' greatest goal was to keep the tribes together, Moses needs to be flexible and open to doing things a little bit differently. And we learn something about Moses here in this moment, and that's the fact that he does want to keep the people cohesive, even if it ultimately means that he has to deviate from this plan. Our tradition has a very long history of in or out. You're either part of or rejected. You are sinful or pure. And in this moment, we have this kind of binary of personal autonomy from Gad and Reuven, while also being part of the communal enterprise. And it's not fair to just call Moses strict or inflexible. He has a really, really traumatizing leadership experience with the Israelites. And that trauma still sits in his heart very deeply. His 10-verse monologue of frustration is really emblematic of his pain. And in verse 6, when he says, "Are your brothers to go to war while you stay here?" This wasn't him attacking the two tribes, but rather an invitation to engage in dialogue with them. And the best part is that Reuven and Gad respond in openness and engage in that conversation with him. And they have a hard conversation together. And Gad and Reuven say that they're planning to build pens for their cattle and schools for their kids, and to serve as the front line for the Israelites, protecting anyone who wants to come into the promised land. They say our nachala, our inheritance, is here on the other side of the Jordan River, and it's not in Israel proper, if you will. And they even try to negotiate and say, you know what, we're going to come back here after all of the Israelites cross over. We will go and cross over with everyone else, and then we will come back to this area. And while Moses doesn't agree with what they're trying to do, he realizes that he has to negotiate with them, otherwise he's going to lose them. And through this calm conversation, or maybe not so calm conversation, they're able to hear and understand one another. And we also have to give credit to Gad and to Reuven, who say, we need to have more independence, more space, and we care deeply about the collective as well. And what's good for us might not be good for all, but we want to negotiate and have a hard discussion and come to a conclusion together thoughtfully. And thoughtfully is the key word here. They don't just turn away or turn off, they dive deeply instead. And that really is the key element. Gad and Reuven want to maintain their independence, and relevance, and protect the group. They seek an agreement and create a joint decision. And Moses doesn't ask for God to give a ruling in this moment. And God doesn't intervene. Moses makes his own call. We are left to make these kinds of decisions on our own. There are two ways to read this interaction. One way is to see Gad and Reuven as negligent and inconsiderate with a conceding Moses. And alternatively, we look at Moses, Gad, and Reuven and understand that it is better to include these two tribes, even if they are not living out the ideal that Moses imagined. Removing the binary can make it seem like we lose something. But when we look at human relationship and interaction, we have a tendency to make it black or white, forgetting that the gray actually gives us enormous space to experiment and come together. And thinking of this, we also have a lesson in collectivism versus autonomy and individualism, community versus disconnect. I didn't vote for that president, so this is not my government. I don't like that new Moroccan, Tunisian rabbi, so I don't like the temple. Human relationships are not just based on one aspect or one way of connecting, but instead finding the yes, finding the common, cooperation. We can have the ability and courage to disagree sharply and even feel betrayed by each other, thinking that the other side is bringing us to the abyss, but must still find common ground that brings us together. Because whether we acknowledge it or not, we are all in this together. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.